now so that we can have a record of this and allow you to share it with others. Please put your questions in the bottom right-hand corner. You'll see a Q&A, and you're welcome to upvote those questions as well if there's things that are compelling to you, and we'll ask as many of them as we can. We're going to come back around 5 o'clock and start getting some questions in, but I'm going to turn this over to my good friend Wendy Smooth right now, and I thank you all in advance for being here, all of our guests and all of those who joined us. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you to all of our participants on the panel. I am certainly looking forward to this engaging conversation. This series has been so generative and so timely in terms of us thinking about the pivotal role that sports plays in shaping society, but also thinking about it at this really critical moment, this really critical juncture where we have been through this moment of the pandemic, where we are not escaping the news as a culture. We have been leaning into the news, leaning into the conversations, trying to make sense of both social change challenges, inequalities that have been uncovered through the pandemic. I feel like we are all in a collective conversation around the world in terms of thinking about inequality, thinking about social justice issues, and thinking about change. And I know here on the campus of The Ohio State University, we have been especially engaged in these conversations around what is our role as a university community to think about social justice issues and what role do we play in change. So I couldn't be more happy to have this conversation with a group of folks who've been thinking about this, and not only thinking about it, but living it in their day-to-day life practices. So we've been instructed with this opportunity to talk about narratives of change. When I think about narratives, I think about the stories that we get to tell about how we are a part of change, the change that's happening around us, and how we play a role in creating stories that shape society. So I've been drawn to a few stories here just in the last few weeks, right? That we're all drawn into the story of Dante Wright's untimely killing at the hands of a police officer, again, in the Twin Cities. Just the other evening, Minnesota MLB, the NBA, the NHL all decided to postpone their games in light of Dante Wright's killing in the Twin Cities. We also can think about these police shootings, but we also think about questions like societal voting rights and what is happening in Atlanta in terms of the moving of the All-Star game by Major League Baseball. These are all stories that sports is telling about society, asking us to engage, to take a moment to think. So I wanted to start off with our conversation after that kind of context. Start our conversation off with why this moment? Why are we now at this moment and in this space where the narratives of athletes standing up and being a part of social change conversations, why are we now seeing this so seamlessly going hand in hand? Athletes standing up and being a part of the narrative of the conversation. Nicole, I'm going to start with you as a writer, one who thinks about narrative all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this has to do with a lot more people realizing that this was never, like, sticking to sports is not a thing, and that never was, and that there's always been, there's always been stands about social injustices. We think of the Olympics, we think of all these historic moments, Jackie Robinson, it's Jackie Robinson Day, right? Like, these things aren't like this whitewashed version of history, even though sometimes people like to think they are. So I think you have a different generation of storytellers who didn't come up thinking I'm only going to write about things that are inside the lines, and are more open to it. But also, I just think, like, it would be irresponsible not to cover these things. It's sort of like, if you cover these athletes when they do great things on the field, but then ignore them when they talk about things that are important to them, like, why would they ever talk to you? Why would they ever trust you? it just feels incredibly disingenuous to ignore these things. So I know for me, you know, I've been thinking a lot about it in terms of college sports. It's very hard, I think, with the power dynamics for college athletes to speak out about stuff. And social media has been a huge avenue for that. We saw it with the women's tournament and how Sedona Prince's video literally went viral because she posted it to her own platform. It did not go through like an interview with reporters, right? Like it was her unfiltered opinion on stuff and what she was seeing. And so I feel like that created the coverage because it was the way that she wanted to put it out there. And I think that we saw it a lot last summer on a number of different college campuses about, you know, racist statues and naming of buildings that people wanted to have taken down. It wasn't easy for like Kellen Mond to say that at Texas A&M. I'm just working on a pre-draft profile of him, so I was just rereading all of this recently. And like, it's not easy. And, you know, that was something that kind of followed him into the season. You alienate part of your fan base, whatever it might be. But it just feels like we're in this different era now where athlete voices, you know, the power balance is shifting away from just coaches and sort of this like paternalistic approach to everything where the coach knows best and school knows best and you just kind of like suck it up, be grateful for your scholarship, to like genuinely having these conversations. And one of the first things I did after George Floyd was killed was say to my editors, we need to talk to college coaches, which are predominantly white coaches, about their predominantly Black rosters and how they're supporting people, especially from afar. There was a lot of people still remote at that time. Because these are just, again, it's not divorced from the sport and the thing that they're playing. So I just think like those stories, I think that there's more storytellers who are hopefully listening to the people that they cover and asking them about these things and covering them. And I think, again, just sort of not only, you know, taking the stance of the owners or, you know, the people in power who've been in power for so long and just kind of parroting that and ignoring the voices of, you know, the people working, the people that we love, the people that play these games that make them go. And so I think that there's just been a general shift in that in general. I think you've even seen it just in the way that like labor disputes have been covered, like with baseball or the NBA last summer when they were working through protocols for like their seasons. You had a lot more people sympathizing with the players themselves. And I think that's just a cultural shift of understanding, like, we don't need to only have the perspective of like a 70-year-old billionaire who owns a team, right? And so I think it's kind of all of those things happening at once. But the most important thing is literally just listening to the people that you cover and treating them with respect. And if something is important to them, writing about it and showing up. And like, I have colleagues that were like the only reporters who went to some of those on-campus protests after George Floyd's death. And they was like texting, we're like, there's 30 people on this beat and there's only one reporter here. And it's like, how could you cover these athletes and not grant them the respect of showing up to something that is important to them? And I hope that is shifting. I think that it is. But that's where I come at it from a writing standpoint is if this is important to someone, they deserve for us to listen and to give them that space for their voices to be heard.
Thank you, Nicole. Cyd, you want to weigh in on this conversation about the narratives that athletes are putting forward and how this has become a seamless connection between athletes creating and putting forth their narratives and social change?
You know, when you look at what we write about, you know, journalists can make news or they can follow the news. And I think that, you know, Nicole hit on something super important. But we did, this moment did not just arrive out of nowhere. It's come from the push for free agency in the NFL with the players wanting more say in their own lives. It came from the Clippers players telling the NBA they were not going to take the court as long as Donald Sterling continued to be the owner of the Clippers. This has been built, Ed O'Bannon saying, no, I own my own likeness. The rise of the power of the athlete is the big story here. And now we are seeing the athletes being able to dictate the schedule of their leagues, postponing games. And if you're a journalist and you're not writing about this stuff, you're just not doing your job at this point. I mean, somebody who's not following this stuff and getting ahead of it and talking to the athletes, you know, at OutSports, our big thing is elevating the voices of athletes and people in the community. That's been what we've done for 20 years. I'm super proud that Katie is one of the voices that we were able to elevate, years ago. And frankly, we were the LGBTQ Players Tribune before there was the Players Tribune, because we were going to athletes, asking them to write their stories, finding ways to elevate their voices. And that's part of us making the news and working with the athletes to make the news. So I think, if you're not following where the trajectory of the power of athletes' voices is headed, I don't know what to tell you. You're not doing your job. And somebody, to Nicole's point, is going to come along who will do it. So again, focusing on what the athletes are doing and elevating their voices.
Thank you, Cyd. Adrien.
How you doing, Wendy?
I'm good. How are you?
All right. So yeah, I agree with both Nicole and Cyd were saying, but I just believe there's more microphones, right? There's more power. The foundation that I work for was built on a individual, and it's an honor of an individual that spoke his voice and his words were heard, and he stood up for what he believed in, which was John McLendon. He was the first Black in many aspects and many things in sports. He was a mentor, but there wasn't that many microphones back then. You look at Muhammad Ali, he had a big microphone in front of him. You look at Tommy Smith and John Carlos, they had a big stage in front of them. Now we have social media. We have given power back to individuals to speak their mind. So I think that is why the space where we're at right now, where athletes and change are just more apparent, because they have more power, I would say.
Thank you so much. Good points around social media and the ability of athletes to build their own platforms, right? Katie, if you would weigh in as well on this connection.
Yeah, I completely agree with what folks have been saying. I think that when it comes to what's different right now, there's certainly been a growing empowerment of athletes. But I also think, what's interesting about what's different about this moment, it makes me think of something that Megan Rapinoe said to me right before the ESPYs, where, she said that really nothing had actually changed since 2016. When she started kneeling and joining Colin Kaepernick in his protest. And that is, in many ways, very true. Ostensibly, nothing has changed since the summer of 2016, when the Minnesota Lynx, initially sparked a protest that happened all throughout the WNBA that summer in response to the killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. I think especially since, we keep talking about Minneapolis in regards to the death of George Floyd, and then again of the young man earlier this week. And so in that sense, what has actually changed is that, athletes who are white and white people in general have decided to pay attention en masse in a way that did not happen 5 years ago, or that did not happen in response to Michael Brown and his death in a sustained way. And so to me, I think that is, that's more reflective of the shift and why we're having these conversations in a different way today. I think there has been a larger cultural allowance for those things to happen, which, yes, speaks to player empowerment, and also to, I think, a large subsection of those in dominant culture who have had a bit of an opinion shift on this topic, or at least at the beginning, and we could talk about whether or not that has sustained itself. But to me, I think those are the two biggest issues that I think of.
Katie, I have to say, I'm taking that terminology on the road. I'll give you credit, I promise, but a larger cultural allowance for these conversations. That is such an incredible phrase to help us think through this. Dante, what are some of your thoughts on where we are in this moment, in this connection?
Well, it's hard to follow up on the words of everyone else before me. I agree so much on what they're saying. The one thing that I think sticks out for me is that in addition to the athlete with the rise of social media, in some ways being their own storyteller, being their own personal journalist, telling their own stories. It also is kind of humanizing athletes. Like, we're put up on these pedestals, we do great things athletically, and that window throughout their entire lifetime usually is very, very short. And this is when people are listening, is when you are an athlete. And then obviously, depending on how high you go and how big of a following you get now, people will still continue to listen to you afterwards. But I think the humanizing aspect is that before we were a name, we were just like everyone else. And then once our careers are over, we're just like everyone else again, for the most part. I mean, obviously, you're going to have some athletes who are a lot more well-known and recognized than others. And, you know, you hear stories of, what was it, James Blake, the tennis player. They didn't recognize him because it was tennis. But other athletes, they get pulled over and like, oh, I know who you are. So it's humanizing in that athletes go through the same things as everyone else, maybe not to the same degree, but sometimes we do. And now being able to hear those stories is a big change and a big shift.
Thank you. I want to remind everyone who's joined us, please go ahead and start putting your questions in the chat. We're going to keep going here for a little bit, but you'll have an opportunity to have some of those questions from the audience go out to our panelists. So please do take the opportunity to place those questions in the Q&A. You know, you all talked about examples in your opening of these kinds of pivotal moments where we saw athletes using their voices, building their own platforms. But could you talk a little bit about any particular narrative that has resonated with you in terms of how you've been thinking about social change? And then for all of us, how do we help be a part of driving conversations? Dante, I'm going to kick it off with you.
So it's hard to pinpoint one particular thing. I think a big part of it, and Katie hit on it, is that, and this is what I've shared in a number of different conversations over the course of the past year or so, is that, and it's what Megan Rapinoe said, like, not a lot has changed. But I think more people are now open to listening and understanding, because quite honestly, I felt like it was George Floyd in the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that really lit a lot for a lot of people, because I think that instance, that situation touched people who, in some ways, that other incidents, other situations didn't really touch them. So it's really hard to pinpoint those types of things. But for me, that kind of is what resonates, is that Black people have been telling these stories for years. And maybe they were only told amongst ourselves. And now that they're being told on a larger stage, and you're saying like, wow, we're hearing all of these different stories, and they're all so poignant. And you know, some of the different scenarios, Zoom conversations like this that I've been a part of and that I've heard, you know, people are crying, people are telling what has happened to them, and you're starting to peel back the layers of the onion that people didn't really understand was there. And for some people are like, wow, you've achieved so much. I had no idea that you have gone through that or even continue to go through these types of things.
Thank you. Katie.
Oh man, it's like being in class and you wait for your name to get called and you kind of
Hey, that's my specialty here now.
Yeah, I'm just like, oh no, it's me. Oh God. Yeah, so I think, you know, I'm rocking that orange hoodie life today, WNBA draft tonight. In terms of narrative, you know, one of the joys of my career, as challenging as it has been, has been following what the WNBA has been doing. And it's, I mentioned the links in 2016, but I think in terms of sustained collective action and role modeling what solidarity looks like, oh my goodness, sorry, my cats are like running around. That to me is like just the core of the narrative of what the W has done as it comes to actually striving for change and implementing change, and having an impact on cultural narrative. The W is, a collection of people who, don't have a tremendous amount of money individually, don't have a tremendous amount of power culturally individually, but together they have really showed what the power of solidarity and what that can do. And in that sense, I find it to be very heartening, even as they have shared their stories of pain and struggle, just to see, the tremendous outcomes that have come from these players. I spent almost a year following Maya Moore as she advocated for the release of Jonathan Irons, who she later buried. So that's kind of cute. But just in terms of getting a wrongfully convicted man out of prison, that's a really tangible outcome. And there aren't a lot of those types of stories in sports. I think the biggest one for the W is not just removing former Senator Kelly Loeffler from office, but removing her from ownership in the league. Those are two very tangible outcomes that were driven by WNBA players. Something that's cited is that, Raphael Warnock, when they wore their Vote Warnock shirts, only was at 9% in the polls, and he's now a senator. They didn't directly cause that, but when it comes to cultural conversation, the way that consciousness is raised, there's no denying the impact on that eventual outcome. And so in that sense, I think it's just what the players of the WNBA have been able to do. It's just been a tremendous story, and one that I've been very honored to cover and will continue to.
And we'll continue following your coverage as well. Certainly, the moment of the Atlanta Dream enacting that collective action power really shifts the power dynamic between owners and players in a really kind of profound way. That's certainly a story that I've watched intently as a fan of the WNBA. Adrien, let me have you come in into the conversation.
Yeah, look, like what Dante said, there's not been really one event that I think that happened for me. I think it's a compilation of events, right? We had Rodney King when I was in high school. I lived in Charlottesville, Virginia when they came marching on Charlottesville. So those are things that people are becoming more aware of. Then we have George Floyd. We have other things in between as well. I think individuals become more empathetic. And I always talk about being curious and empathetic. And I hope that will progress change, right? If more people are curious about others and empathetic about where they come from and what they've been through, I think change will progress forward. So, like I said, I don't know if there's one particular event because I've seen it a lot in my lifetime. But I think the opportunity, again, technology and social media is there and people are actually seeing it and whoa, this is really happening. Charlottesville was a big eye opener for a lot of individuals in Charlottesville, really to see that. It was an eye opener for me because I've never seen anybody physically march and hate people in the march. And that's what their whole mission was. So I think just being more empathetic, and we're seeing that, and hopefully we continue to be that and be curious and be curious about one another. So not one incident for me.
Well, Adrien, the whole thing of curiosity and empathy, do you think athletes have a special way of building empathy based on kind of how we engage with them and their talent and engage with them and their potential platform? And I'm just kind of going back to you because that idea about building empathy is so critical right now.
Yeah, I guess when you talk about athletes being on a team, I was a college student athlete. So just being on a team, you learn, I don't know, it's that team atmosphere is a little bit different. You don't like everybody or you don't hang with everybody, but that's, you know, that's your family. And that's part of family too, in the families. But you're empathetic because you get to learn, and you're curious because they're your teammates, and you get that time with them. And I feel that that's something that if the world could take, if we could put that in the world today, it would be, we would be at a better place. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the empathy that I see within athletics that we can emulate.
It totally does. And, you know, invoking that concept of teams, building empathy and curiosities about each other. You know, on our class in our university, we're always building teams of students to work together on small projects, and very much inspired by exactly what you're saying about the idea that if we get students with different backgrounds sitting together in conversation and working together to solve a problem, then we're going to build those curiosities, and we're going to build some empathy that we can scale up, right? That you've known someone who's had this particular experience. So really, really great points, and really great points for us as a university learning community. Thank you. Cyd, what are your thoughts around this idea of, are there narratives that are sticking out for you around this moment of change?
You know, at OutSports, my entire career has been built around telling the stories of LGBTQ athletes and convincing non-LGBTQ people to talk about, in sports, talk about tough issues, talk about same-sex marriage and homophobia and transphobia. So my career has been wrapped around going beyond the score and beyond the assists and beyond the touchdowns and talking about these harder issues. A moment that sticks out in my head, there's a woman on Fox News named Laura Ingraham. And a few years ago, LeBron James gave an interview and he started talking about politics. She didn't like it. She told him, very famously, to shut up and dribble. And that moment always stuck out to me, because here you have this person who has built her career around talking about politics. She's essentially telling me that my career is null and void because I interweave politics and social issues in sports. And she's telling somebody like LeBron James that his voice is not welcome here. And that shut up and dribble always stuck with me as a moment, I think, where LeBron James had a pretty strong reaction. And I think a lot of athletes, it gave them a moment to say, wow, this is how a lot of America views us. And I reject that. And I think since then, there has been almost a badge of honor to, you know, to give the middle finger to Laura Ingraham, and to have a voice in your life and to not just dribble and score touchdowns. And, you know, this past year, to see Natasha Cloud decide to skip a season so she can go advocate for equality and build understanding. I mean, talk about the complete opposite of just being told to shut up and dribble. You know, I just, as I've been thinking about listening to everybody, those are the moments that come to mind, and how we've gone just in 3 years from this public expectation among a lot of people. And there's some people who still, you know, want athletes to not talk about this stuff, but it has changed a lot. And those moments are what stick out to me over the last few years.
Thank you, Cyd. When you said Laura Ingraham, I went, yep, that didn't go well for her, because LeBron's mic was a little bit bigger, right? Than the mic that she was necessarily holding at the moment.
And he made a lot more sense. What she was saying didn't make sense. It resonated to a small group of people, but I think most Americans understand that you have the right to your opinion and to say what you want and to advocate for yourself. And I think that's why, not just the size of the microphone, that's why LeBron's message got through a lot better than hers did.
Sure. And her message was ahistorical, because as we've been talking about here, this is not a new moment. It's an intensity moment, but it's not a new moment in terms of the role of athletes in social change. Nicole, you talked in your earlier comments about, the need to cover the richness of athletes' stories. So is there a particular moment of change that has kind of resonated with you as you've been covering these stories over the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of the examples that have been brought up are certainly kind of ones that go beyond just sports. Certainly the ones that end up getting covered by like the Today Show and stuff are those moments where that crossover is transcending just our sports bubbles. I think even smaller too, a lot of the things I've noticed in the last year in particular, I mean, like think about how many white coaches have had to say the word racism and racist and systemic injustices and describe them, right? Like people have had to educate themselves and learn about things and have conversations that they would not have had otherwise. I do think that a lot of that is already fading into the background, which is a shame. And I think, I worked on a project with two of my coworkers a couple weeks ago about the Eyes of Texas and the song at the University of Texas. And we talked to a bunch of former players, some white, some black, about the song and how it was basically an unspoken thing. Like for the black players at some point in their careers there, someone told them about the origins of that song and they stopped singing it. And they would just do the horns up and they would just stand there and mouth the words if they had to pretend or whatever. But so we were sharing those lived experiences before it became trendy, before it became more universally okay to raise these issues, right? I mean, we've all made fun of all of these, like, these brands rushing to put out these statements last summer, but then not doing anything systemic, right? And so it's sort of like that question, and Texas has been a really interesting microcosm of that because part of the reason Tom Herman had issues at the end at Texas was the way he handled the Eyes of Texas controversy and the way that he backed his players in that situation. Steve Sarkisian comes in, one of the first things he says, they're going to be up there, they're going to stand, they're going to sing for it. And the school, does this investigation, and you have all of these like emails from all these racist donors saying that they're going to pull their donations, right? Like you have all these things happening, and now it's a year later or almost a year later, and like, are we back to normal? Like, are we back to just the statements? I think of Kylan Hill and the Confederate flag in Mississippi. That was a really important moment, like to what Katie said about the Atlanta Dream. Like, it's not the only reason that flag got taken down, but it was a contributing factor. So there's always that crossover. And so again, it's covering it, but it's also thinking about the littler things, like seeing certain words in a statement, being precise with language when you're a head coach or an organization putting out a statement to condemn something. I think also we've seen, even just, again, I keep being drawn to the women's tournament and the inequities there recently. I have never heard this many male colleagues say stuff like, why is it called the Final Four, but then the women's Final Four? And why is it March Madness and they don't say March Madness? And why is it the tournament, but then it's the women's tournament? Like, why is there this othering? And we have been saying this for years, and it asks these questions about branding and the framing, and people never thought about it. It just wasn't a thing. And now you have these male colleagues and also administrators, but even just in media, about the way they talk about it, raising that issue. And for years, that light bulb had not gone off. And all of a sudden you're like, wow, this is ridiculous. And it's like, we have been trying to say that you're treating it as if it's other, and the default is this, and it's the men's version of that thing. Like, let's talk about that. So it's to me, we can talk about these macro examples as well, because they're really like seared in our collective cultural memory, but also like the preciseness of language and the way that we frame. And if we label something men's basketball instead of just basketball, what that signals in terms of clarity and communication, but also inequality, in that you're labeling both, and you're not just saying one is the default and the other one is the other. So it's a lot of those things that I think have prompted conversations, and I think have changed, again, some of the way that the framing has happened. I think once that light bulb goes off on stuff like that, then you think about it the rest of the way when you're covering these issues.
Excellent. you've all talked about, this isn't the first moment. Nicole, in that example with Texas, this is perennial. We hear this story every few years, right? So one of the things we can say is that in that light bulb moment going off that you talked about, change happens in fits and starts, right? So we can have this revved up moment, all eyes on Minnesota with what was happening with George Floyd. And then, we may not hear anything until there's a next high profile killing or slaying. So the question becomes like, how do we keep change moving, right? How do we keep going, 2 steps ahead and not taking that 2 steps, 1 step back, right? How do we keep, or what role can we play in keeping these stories moving forward, or helping, having these stories help us move forward, rather than this kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back? Katie, can you start us off?
Yeah. To me, it's not necessarily about how do we avoid the step, how do we avoid moving backwards? There will always be a counter revolution in response to revelatory change. There will always be a backlash. To me, it's more about how do those of us who are committed to doing the work and say that we're committed to doing the work continue to go to work every day and do that, knowing that there will be times when the work is harder than others, where it feels like we're not making any change, but we are laying the foundation for change to occur. That to me is one of the hardest things about being invested in social justice. Is that it's not, like just progress isn't linear, like it doesn't move in a straight line forward. I think as a member of like the LGBTQ community, I'm acutely aware of that right now in terms of, I remember being on the road and winning marriage equality in 2015. And, that in some ways, I think people thought, like some folks thought that would be the conclusion to a story. And yet it certainly is not, in terms of the ways in which we have seen sustained attacks on the LGBTQ community, like writ large, on trans youth specifically, sort of hacking away at the rights of, or at least trying to hack away at the rights of our community in different ways. And every demographic, I think, can speak to that, as a Black person, like that certainly is just a piece of history that is endemic to our identity. And so when we talk about, the importance of those macro moments, as we have been today, like I think Nicole really hits it on the head when we also think about the importance of those micro interactions of consciousness raising. Like when you don't want to have that hard conversation with the person in your family that really needs it. When you don't want to, go do the hard work in the hard places. Call in a colleague and hold someone accountable. Pick up the phone and ask that extra question with that tough phone call and make, that extra little reporting bit matter. Like those are the things that I think keep us moving forward, even when it feels like, we're sliding back.
Thanks. Dante, what are your thoughts about how we keep this energy moving forward?
I think a big part of it is just continuing to tell the stories and making people listen. Nicole had a good point. Like if you're not talking about something, then people won't be aware. When she used the example of comparing the men's and women's sides, because I think what happens, a lot of people get stuck with their blinders on and they only see what they see, and it takes having your eyes open to the experiences of someone else for you to, and it's not going to just, one conversation a lot of times. You're gonna have to be beat over the head with messaging sometimes, and then you finally get it. Because like Nicole said, women have been saying this for years, and I saw your reaction when you started almost jumping out of your chair. Same thing with LGBTQ community, Black, like all minorities have been saying these things for years. And it just takes continuing to tell the stories not letting up. And I think what we're also seeing is a generation of people who are growing up with more diverse people around them. All of our young kids now are growing up with more diverse people around them. They're used to seeing all different walks of life, which is very different. I mean, my family, my mother, father, grandparents, obviously, grew up in segregation, and I didn't, and my kids haven't. And I also think that kids now are a lot more aware than you think that they are. And the more you have those conversations, Katie's right, have those tough conversations, because I actually had this thought this morning, is it'd be interesting to see how many, like if you just took like a minority family and a white family or non-minority and said, how many of you have ever talked about race in your family conversations and the impact that it has on your daily lives? How different that informal or formal poll could look. So the more that you talk about these things, the more you become aware, and the more you realize, like, man, that's got to change. And I'm going to be a part of that change to make that happen.
Excellent, excellent. You know, Cyd, as you said, you've been a part of this, you know, storytelling and pushing for change around LGBTQ issues in sports. But how do we keep this momentum going? I mean, as Katie just talked about, you know, there's movement forward, and then we see this backlash, right? And we're seeing backlash with kids sports, right? So how do we keep the change moving in a forward-facing direction?
Again, I look at it from my perspective as a member of the media, and to me, we have a freedom of press for two reasons. It's not to make snarky comments on Twitter, no matter how fun that is, or do softball interviews with athletes, no matter how fun that is. And I do all those things. But the reason we have the freedom of press is to, one, uncover the truth, and two, hold people in power accountable to the people. And that's how I've approached my work. You know, I realized very early on years ago that the level of homophobia in men's sports was actually a lot lower than people realize, and among athletes, and that perception of homophobia was really scaring kids to stay in the closet. And I've gone about my career uncovering the truth. The truth is that homophobia in men's sports is not at the level we thought it was. But sometimes that homophobia creeps up, and it creeped up last Friday when a U.S. men's national team player called one of his teammates in a very casual way a homophobic slur. And I pressed Major League Soccer, I pressed the player, I pressed the Galaxy, you know, before writing my article on that. And we're going to continue to press them to make sure that they respond to this, because it's so easy for them to pass off, oh, he was just joking or whatever. But that joke is the very reason that people have this perception of men's sports. So, you know, we as journalists have to, even in sports, continue to get to the truth. What is the truth? What's really going on? And make people in power be accountable to the people and the fans in a way that the fans can't or won't do.
Wow, that's really compelling, this idea of the positioning between the journalist and the fan. I could sit with you for a long time with that, Cyd, and thinking through that. So I may come back to you with a little bit of probe on that. Adrien, what are your thoughts about how we keep this energy moving forward?
Yeah, I guess I'm piggybacking on what everybody said, but Cyd said it, he just said it. It's really about consistency to me. We have to be consistent with our hitting them over here, just like Cyd said he's going to do with the LA Galaxy story. And consistency becomes a habit, and then people will start talking about it. It's just like building your body. If you want to get in shape, you're not going to do it that first week. And change is hard too. We have to realize that. The people that want change, we have to realize that it does take time. But if we are consistent in our message, if we very consistent in our actions, other people will see it. And if we keep pressing others, I think that meaningful change will take hold.
That's a really great comment about the kind of way I always talk about civil rights and think about voting rights. I always talk to students about it as the long game. It's not the short game. It's not one election at a time. It's really thinking about the long arc of how we're talking about things. Now, we're thinking about this moment of, real, feels some significance around change. But there's also been some moments of stumbling blocks. And if we're going to be really real here in a good conversation and an honest conversation, we have to also pick up those kinds of missed opportunities, the stumbling blocks that have happened as we're thinking about social change. Are there any kind of stumbling blocks or missed opportunities that you would call out that might have been moments for significant change or high impact and we just kind of missed it or didn't do enough? You can take that on a personal level or you can take that on a societal level. Nicole, I'll start with you. And what I'll do this time, to Katie's point about my teacher influence, I'll let you put a kind of hand up when you're ready to jump into this one. Nicole, and not everyone has to respond. Nicole.
Well, I just think this whole conversation is speaking to this point that actually nothing is like changed in the last year. It's just now it's more acceptable to write about these issues and public opinion has shifted, right? And people watched 8 minutes and 46 seconds and felt awful about it and felt that, wow, this is such a problem, when you have ignored or listened and then moved on from stories from our Black colleagues and friends for years, right? So I think the whole thing is kind of a missed conversation, right? Like this should have been happening for years. And I think honestly, it's also, again, like I think we're starting to have these conversations now, but you're starting to actually have people address like the fuller picture of some of these historical moments I was talking about earlier that have kind of gotten like lost to history a little bit, about how contentious things were and how hated certain figures were in the past who were fighting for change, right? Like the joke everyone makes, right, is like, oh, everyone just posts an MLK quote on Martin Luther King Jr. Day and it was so peaceful, all of his moments. Like, no, he was killed because it was forcing people to think about things uncomfortably. And so I think that it's like when people reflect back on like Jackie Robinson's path to integrating baseball and different moments in sports history, I think that the reflecting is getting more fuller. And I think that is showing that we missed it, either maybe not in the moment, but, even in the 10 years after, the 20-year anniversaries of stuff like Muhammad Ali, right? Like everything was getting whitewashed. Everything was getting like kind of fitting into a perfect box. And I think it's stuff like that, because we're talking about like, how do you continually move? Like, how do you keep change? How do you keep these issues in the forefront? It's by covering them accurately and covering the ugly parts and talking about them. And I think that that's the part that's really uncomfortable for a lot of journalists. And if you don't do that, then you don't move forward, and you also are missing the full picture. And I think that, everyone always says journalism is the first draft of history, right? But I also think even like when you look at like 5-year anniversaries, 10-year anniversary things, you can already see it starting to frame and change and shift differently. And so I think it's really important to like continue to highlight all of the sides of these issues and just not like, oh my God, it was so easy or it was so inevitable, because nothing is, right? Like when people are forcing change, there's always going to be pushback. To Katie's point earlier, was always going to be like a counter movement. And so you have to acknowledge all of that and cover it at the time, but you also have to be really conscious of whose voices you're elevating and whose voices you're not. And are you giving equal weight to something or are you not? I was talking to Michael Phelps's agent yesterday, because we were just catching up about the Olympics, and he was bringing up how many people just continually are like just passing along talking points from USA Gymnastics and leadership there, even though after the Larry Nassar scandal, after all of these issues in this sport with sexual assault and sort of like these cultural and leadership issues there, like why are you passing along those person's words as if they carry a certain amount of weight after you know what you know, right? So it's like all of those little conscious decisions. But I think, you know, again, I'm not thinking of one specific example of like a totally drop ball, but I do think you can see it in the number of cases looking back on situations that, you know, are being framed, or like the public think that something happened that didn't happen. It just shows how across the board this was, where, you know, it was what is palatable to like a mostly white audience versus in a mostly male audience and a mostly straight audience versus like what actually was happening and who was pushing barriers. And so, I mean, again, like this Eyes of Texas story I just did with my colleagues was such a great example of this, because, you know, it was, you know, it was politically popular to come out against racism in general, right, last summer. But now, okay, now you've got these letters from these donors, you've got people threatening to pull stuff. How are people actually responding now that the light is elsewhere, right? And so, you know, you're already seeing things revert back to normal, and you can already see that, like, oh, looking back, yeah, like, oh yeah, it was great, they used their voices, right? Like you can already see that some of this stuff is going to be framed differently. It's like, oh yeah, they spoke up, great. Like it did, you know, we didn't change it because like we're, you know, kind of defining history this way. But like, yeah, they use their voices, right? Like very different than like what actually in that moment, the demands, the protests, like what they were actually pushing, the meetings. You can already see that stuff like shifting in the way that it's covered. So I think there's just been a lot of examples, because we are seeing now of people being like, oh, actually, here's the full picture of something that wasn't covered that way at the time.
Thanks, Nicole. You just really held us to the power of following a story over the long haul, right? And not just the kind of hype moment, but to really like investigate and stay with a story. Cyd, you ready to get in here? You're on mute.
I told myself not to do that today. There I go. There, you finally got one. You finally got one. See, I lowered my hand.
The product of the times, my friend.
So, you know, Nicole touched on it briefly. I feel like we blow it every 2 years of the Olympic Games. Every 2 years, the Olympic Games are a fantastic opportunity to talk about human rights, whether it's LGBTQ rights in Japan later this year, genocide and slave labor in China next year. You know, I really am not a fan of Olympic boycotts. I'd rather leave international diplomacy to people we elect to do that, and not punish the athletes. But it's an amazing opportunity to go to China and talk about these issues. And the IOC has for years pushed back against using the Olympics to talk about these issues. And I think that we have to stop. You know, I really was so disappointed with how the media and athletes almost ignored the LGBTQ issues in Sochi in 2014 universally. I mean, they just blew it. And I would much rather go to these Olympic Games and use the games to talk about these bigger issues while we're celebrating the athletes. And we just don't see enough of it, because there are very real issues that go beyond our borders that are going on in Rio and Beijing and everywhere else that hold the Olympic Games.
What a terrific point about that moment of opportunity that we can have to broaden our minds and broaden our understandings beyond just what we're seeing in the pool or on the field, but to really understand the context in which we're operating. What a terrific challenge for us, Cyd. Thanks for putting that forward. You know, we don't have a whole lot of time left, so I want to make sure we get to this question, because I think this is a question that really unites this series around intersectionality and social change. And I also want to encourage folks to put their questions in the Q&A, because we're going to go to questions from the audience in just a little bit. But, you know, we've been talking about change. We've been talking about the role of the journalist, the role of the athlete, how we cover the journalist. How do we, as kind of individuals, both as, you know, we have athletes who are listening in, who are part of our audience. We have students who are non-athletes and just really great fans. We have teachers, professors, when we're in our lane, how can we all be agents of change, right? So how can we all become a part of this conversation and not just consumers kind of sitting back and reading the statements from our favorite brands on a particular issue, but how do we get in the arena, right? And be a part of change as an agent of change. Dante, I'm going to kick it off with you.
It's interesting you asked that question because I've said this to a number of people again over the past year. Seek out people to talk to who you don't know much about, to start to understand what they're going through. And just don't pick one person. So if you don't understand racism, just don't pick one Black person, because through all of our different differences of who we are, we're not all just one type. Like, we all have so varied experiences, so you just can't check your one LGBT box by talking to one person. And have open mind, open your ears, do a lot of listening, asking questions, but it also has to be in a safe space. And sometimes that's challenging to do. Even in my personal life over the past year, I've had some really challenging conversations, and I've told people things that I've never said before. But I think it's a sign of the times, and I think more people are willing to share their experiences and their truth and what they've gone through. And at the same time, I see more and more people who are willing to listen. So I'd say try to educate yourself. And maybe that's a book, but a lot of it is just hopefully talking face to face, person to person, sitting down with someone.
Thank you. Adrien.
Yeah, mine is just pretty simple. Everybody has a story. Get to know those stories of you don't know what people have been through, and get to know that story. And I promise you, there will probably be some common ground or commonalities with that story. So again, that goes back to being curious about others and what they've been through.
Well, I can't think of a better way to close out at least this part of this conversation than on that point about narratives and listening to everyone's story. We all have stories. The stories connect our lives when we really get to listen to each other. So thank you all for allowing me to listen to your perspectives. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Nicole, who's going to bring in the questions from the audience. It's been a pleasure.
This has been an incredible conversation. I don't want it to stop, but I do want to make sure that we get some of our questions asked. And our top voted question comes from Emma, who wants to know, how do we navigate through conversations with folks who don't want the kind of change that we're striving for and don't believe that such change is necessary? Dante, can you start us with that?
That's the crux of the issue. Some people, they're not going to change. You can't convince them. If they're dead set fast in one way, they're just not going to change. And it's challenging. And maybe you continue to have the conversation with them. But from my experience, when you have a conversation with someone like that, they change the goalposts. So you can talk them and you can get them in a corner and they realize they are kind of defeated. Like the point that they're trying to make is incorrect. They just will direct it somewhere else, and it's hard to get them back to the original point. But it's a difficult thing to do. Trust me, I've had those conversations. But I guess the one thing you can do is continue to have it, but just realize that people who are set in their ways, it's going to be harder to move them, especially if you're at one end of the spectrum and they're at the other. Trying to get them to move is tough.
Katie, how do you, Joel's asking about how you address people who say they just want to watch sports without all the political and social narrative being injected.
I mean, yeah, me too. Like, I too wish that there wasn't, racism and sexism and systemic oppression abound. Like, I absolutely wish that was not a thing. I think, in general, how I engage in those types of conversations with folks is to kind of press them on the point of like what has changed for them. Like, I think it's a real function of privilege to be able to watch something and choose not to see what people who are marginalized see, and who experience oppression can see. And that is true for many of us in different respects, right? So like the privilege that I bring to a space, like in terms of like class and education, allows me to not always have to engage in certain conversations. Just as like someone who is cisgender, who is straight, like doesn't engage with LGBTQ topics in the same way that I would. They don't see them in the same way. And so when you're forced to engage on that topic and you get to choose, like that to me is that function of privilege. And I always try to gently point that out. And whenever like I have these hard conversations, like usually using I statements and talking about what I experienced, as opposed to engaging in a space of persuasion, that can be really hard because often you are presenting an opinion that you believe is right to try and get someone else to accept your right opinion. And that creates a lot of conflict and defensiveness right off the bat. And so one of the things I learned in grad school is we spent a lot of time talking about dialogue. And the thing about dialogue is that true dialogue has no winners. It's about listening. It's about accepting perspectives. And so I find that whenever I'm engaging in those conversations where someone just does not see the world the same way that I do and wishes that the way that I saw the world would sort of disappear, that's where I go first.
Nicole knew I was going to call on her next, apparently. So jump in, Nicole.
Yeah, no, I think, one example that kind of comes to mind isn't really necessarily about like kind of being on the right side of history on some of these issues, although I do think sometimes if you think about things that way, it does frame some of this, even when it is exhausting and even when it does feel like an uphill battle. I think also, honestly, like the reason that this stuff seeps into stuff like sports or music or whatever is because otherwise you're avoiding it, right? You're seeking out spaces that aren't having these hard conversations. And so that's why people get upset about this. It's supposed to be a quote safe haven for them, but like it's actually the reason that it matters is it's happening in these spaces because it's the way to reach you, right? Like that's the way to, if there's a boycott and there isn't an NBA game, then like it affects your life because this is your team that you like to root for and you enjoy watching them. Oh, now you're actually forced to confront an issue, right? Like that's how boycotts work and how these things operate. So it is supposed to be inconvenient. And that's kind of why, and again, it's not a direct comparison to issues of like, gender orientation or racism or anything like that. But I even think back about like reporting around COVID last summer. A lot of people didn't want to read anything about COVID. They didn't want to think that it was going to impact sports. It didn't, again, this thing that they really liked, they didn't want it to impact, they didn't even want to hear that the schedule was going to be adjusted, right? So you would even write, like I wrote at some point in July about how like conference championship games might get pushed back a couple of weeks just to build in extra flexibility in the schedule. People didn't like to think about anything changing. And I felt, it was the responsible thing to do was to, write about this stuff and about the intersection of, again, a once in a lifetime pandemic and sports, write about it responsibly and talk to a lot of doctors and scientists about it. But also like, if I was talking to expert sources and they were talking about why masks work or why distancing is important, I was putting that in the story because again, if you're actively not looking for information, I'm going to sneak it in there, right? And so I think that that's some of the way that you can, again, when you're forcing issues like change and things in spaces that other people don't necessarily want it to be, it's almost like sneaking it in there to get it into that space that they didn't think it was going to be, but you're meeting them where they are and trying to like put in like some good information or some good perspective, some food for thought into something that they didn't necessarily think was going to include that. And so I think that that is being responsible as a journalist, right? Like it was relevant to the stories and it was relevant to all the contingency planning people were doing. It wasn't what the readers necessarily wanted to hear. But you know what? They're making these decisions because they were talking to doctors and medical experts who were saying this, and here's why. So I'm going to include that in the story. Maybe you're going to learn something and be like, oh, this is why you're distancing 6 feet. Like, that's why this number was picked. I don't know. I mean, but I was going to try. That was just part of my overall strategy about trying to report on it responsibly.
I love that you were going to try. Well, we have a great question here that I think, we'd really like to know is what athletes, I'm going to throw journalists in there too, are doing, aside from, of course, the two that we wonderfully have with us, that are doing a great job of using their platform to create meaningful change. And Adrien, can you think of anyone that you've seen or material that you consume where you really feel like, yes, this is making a real difference?
Yeah, I mean, the one front and center for me is the program that we just launched last July 13th with Coach John Calipari and Coach Tommy Amaker. It came to us because the two coaches wanted to take action. That was their thoughts, like, okay, we've done listening, we want to take action. And so it's come to fruition. Like, this the first into the first cohort. We just posted new opportunities for minorities for access and opportunity. So I think that's the front and center change. One person that I follow is Jalen Rose, the commentator. A lot of people probably don't know that he has a school, a leadership academy in Detroit that he really doesn't talk about, but I know it's doing awesome things. And that has been, I think, 5+ years now, something like that, that he started that school. So those are things that I think that a lot of people are doing things, but those are two that come to mind to me.
Cyd, do you have thoughts on that? Thank you so much, Adrien.
I follow a lot of people, but I'll tell you, I want to talk about one thing that Katie did when you asked him that question. And Katie built a point of agreement with the person who doesn't want to talk about this stuff. And I have found in my work that instead of this, there are some people who are adversaries against this kind of work, no question. But I found that if you're able to build a point of agreement or point of connection, it helps the conversation go a lot easier, that becomes less adversarial. And then, okay, well, where do we disagree then? On the conversation right now about trans athletes, one of the things that I try to do with people is help them see that what they're saying, they don't actually believe, that their absolute, ban all trans athletes position. It's not actually what they think. They've just been trained to say that. And building a point of it, we may not agree in the ultimate place where we end up, but getting people to back away from there. I don't want to talk about race. There's no racism in the United States. Women are getting paid all they need to get paid. And instead of this fight, just trying to work with them to find, where do we agree? And then let's talk about where we disagree in a more thoughtful manner. That's the kind of conversation I'm looking for a lot more of today.
I hope we're going to find that a lot more today. Sometimes conversation and dialogue seem to be hard to come by. Dante, where are you seeing change?
Well, it's kind of ironic because the person that I go think of is Colin Kaepernick, and obviously with him kneeling created a firestorm and a lot of conversation. But one could say that you really haven't seen a lot of change based on what Colin Kaepernick has done. And it kind of goes to Adrien's point with Jalen Rose, but it's more about the things that he's done out of the public eye, spending his time and his money in the efforts that are making a change. So sometimes it's the things that these athletes are doing where people are like, oh, you have all that money, you're not doing anything. Why aren't you making a statement? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? When in all actuality, a lot of athletes are doing things in their communities where they're playing and or in the communities where they're from. And that's where I go to Kaepernick, because it's so much more than just the kneeling that he's done.
Absolutely. And I think so many more, we're seeing such greater representation in athletes. I mean, in the past, I think it was so much, either subtle or not encouraged. And so now, it seems like this platform is greater. And so, Katie, I'm actually going to ask you to have the last word on this. If an athlete or a coach wanted to be part of the change, how can they amplify their voice to reach a larger audience? How do you think is the best pathway forward?
Well, that's just a bear of a question. Thank you.
No problem.
Quick and easy, something, let me just come up with something. No.
Just 30 seconds.
Yeah. No, I think what's really important when it comes to the question of taking action, participating in a movement for change, is that there is risk. And that's something, tying back into what Dante was saying about Kaepernick in terms of kneeling. Like, what I think is so interesting now is like everybody's kneeling. It's because there's no risk in it. It doesn't actually mean anything in the same way that it did when like a man lost his job. And then the only white athlete to join in that protest almost lost her job. And and so now it's like, okay, cool, everybody kneels, and Colin Kaepernick still doesn't have a job. And you just like can't tell me that he's not good enough to be a backup in the NFL. Like, come on, like that's just not real. And so when thinking about that, I think it's really important to acknowledge that part of participating in change movements is, taking on some of that risk. An essential part of being an ally is shouldering the burden of that risk. And using your privilege to shield you from some of the punishment that someone who does have marginalized experiences and has a marginalized identity in the context in which you are advocating, you're shielding them from the punishment that they may incur. And like that to me is what's important. It's like, there is always going to be a time where you have a choice to either stand up or not, to use your voice or not, to correct your family or your best friends, or step out on a limb, whatever way that looks for you, or you cannot do it. And so when it comes to building a bigger platform, amplifying voices, like the bare minimum, the most important thing to do is that when faced with that choice, you always choose action. And that's what I got.
And I think how could we end any better? Always choose action. Well, I know I speak for everyone in thanking all of you profusely for the time that you spent with us and for the insights that you provided. Thank you, Wendy, for your incredible moderation. And this has just been, I never leave these conversations not wanting to be a better person and to do more and to be part of the change. And I hope that others, I know that others are joining me in that. So I do want to remind everyone that we have one more session of the Intersectionality of Change. And they just keep offering more and more. And so our next one is going to be on reporting out and moving forward. We are going to have a wonderful moderator in Luke Fedlam of Anomaly Sports, who works, of course, with Porter Wright as a sports attorney. Our guest there will be Akila Carter-Franci from the San Jose State Study of Sports, Society, and Social Change, Belkis Clark from Buckeye Inclusion, Donovan Hewitt, Ohio State student athlete and a member of Redefining Athletic Standards, Mushami Robinson, Olympian, Team USA Racial and Social Justice Council Chair, and Kevin Warren, Big Ten Commissioner. So again, thank you to all of you who have joined us. Thank you to our guests, and we hope that you all will go out now and be an agent for change. Thank you so much for being with us.